In this video, we're going to define what the action potential is. By the end of the video, you should be able to identify the movement of which ion defines the action potential. The movement of which ion is the most important in the action potential. And just to remind ourselves, when we're talking about this charge across the membrane with resting membrane potential, at rest, we're measuring the charge inside relative to outside. And now we're going to talk about changes in this charge and changes in the ion distribution inside relative to outside. So the action potential is an electrochemical message that is transmitted down the axon of a neuron. It is an all or none phenomenon, and we'll talk more about this all or none phenomenon later on, but the idea is that once that cell reaches threshold, an action potential occurs. And the action potential is that same amplitude and speed all the time. That's part of that all or none phenomenon that we'll discuss later in a later video. Now, the speed of the nerve impulse can be less than a meter per second to 100 meters per second. Now, thinking back to previous videos, what do you think causes this change? One thing could be the myelination of the axon. Myelinated axons are going to have a faster action potential, and we'll talk in a subsequent video about how that happens. Also, the diameter of the axon is going to affect it. So the diameter of the axon and whether or not it's myelinated, those are two things that can affect the speed of that nerve impulse. So the action potential is a rapid depolarization of the membrane. We already talked about how threshold can vary from one neuron to a neuron, but in any given neuron, that threshold is going to be the same at any given time. And stimulation to the threshold of excitation triggers a nerve impulse or an action potential. And that starts with this massive depolarization of the neuron. So again, here we are at resting membrane potential. Remember, here we're measuring in millivolts inside relative to outside. Here's time in milliseconds. So this is all happening very quickly. And we're at resting membrane potential. Something depolarizes the cell, remember, moves us towards zero, gets us to this threshold of excitation, and then we have this massive depolarization that occurs. So the question is, what causes this massive depolarization? And you can see here a little hint. It says it's the opening of the voltage-gated sodium channels. So these voltage-gated sodium channels are opened when the cell reaches threshold. So what allows this massive depolarization are those voltage-activated or voltage-gated channels that we've discussed. Remember, these are membrane channels. They're proteins embedded into the membrane. Their permeability, so whether they're open or not, whether they allow ions to travel across the membrane, depends on the voltage difference across the membrane. And we've already discussed how sodium-potassium channels are these voltage-activated or voltage-gated channels. So here, remember, at rest, when we're at resting membrane potential, here's our little snapshot of the axon. Here's one bilipid membrane. Here's the other side. So this is the intracellular fluid and the extracellular space. Our sodium channels are closed. The voltage-gated sodium channels are closed, and our voltage-gated potassium channels are leaky. So what happens to the sodium channels when the membrane is depolarized to the threshold of excitation? Remember, these are voltage-gated sodium channels, and when they get to the threshold of excitation, they're going to open like this. So when they open up, that's going to allow sodium to travel in. So remember, at rest, we had all of these sodium ions highly concentrated on the outside, some on the inside, but potassium more highly concentrated on the inside. So with the voltage-gated sodium channels open, where is the sodium ions going to go? Remember, we had a concentration gradient because we have more sodium on the outside and less on the inside that wants to pull that sodium in. We also have an electrical gradient because the sodium ions are positively charged, and at resting membrane potential and even at threshold, we're still at a negative charge inside relative to outside. So both the concentration and the electrical gradient work to pull that sodium in. So you see you have sodium rushes into the cell due to that electrical and chemical or concentration gradients. So now you have a lot of sodium in the cell. That potassium, though, can it go out? These are still leaky, so they can, a little bit can move out, but most of it's trapped inside. So now you have this high concentration of sodium and potassium within the cell, and that changes the charge across the membrane to a positive charge. So here we are at this little X right here. We were at resting membrane potential, sodium channels were closed, potassium channels were leaky. We depolarized a threshold that caused the opening of those voltage-gated sodium channels. We had this massive depolarization, and that massive depolarization was caused by that sodium rushing in. We can see those sodium channels opened up, and that sodium rushed in. And so when we're here at this little snapshot up here, this is what the distribution across the membrane might look like. So inside, we're going to have a high concentration of both sodium and potassium ions, leading to that positive charge. So see, we're here above 0, and it's going to continue. That sodium is going to continue to rush in until we get to a positive, maybe 35. Again, going to vary a little bit from neuron to neuron, but every given neuron is going to have that same amplitude, so the same peak of a positive charge across the membrane. Now we get to this positive charge across the membrane, those sodium channels are going to snap closed, and potassium channels are going to open, because potassium channels are also voltage gated, and they open when there's a positive charge across the membrane. So we've talked about the depolarization. That depolarization, that's the defining nature of the action potential, and it's caused by the opening of those voltage-gated sodium channels at threshold, allowing sodium to rush in. That's what causes this depolarization. In the next video, we'll talk about what causes the repolarization.